Humans were known as special forces. The galaxy prayed never to face them. The old Kreth soldier had no arms below the elbow. Both of them, gone at the joint, sealed over with scar tissue so old it had turned silver. He sat across the processing table from me and said nothing, just watched me with those four pale eyes the way a person watches a fire they know is going to spread. He had been in my intake queue for 6 hours. I had been trying to process his asylum file for 4 of those hours, and every time I reached the section marked Reason for Displacement, the system locked me out. My name is Zal 7. I work for the Galactic Concord Archive on Velhar Prime. My job for the last 19 cycles has been to receive, translate, classify, and preserve the records of conflict across known space. I have processed the final transmissions of civilizations that no longer exist. I have translated the surrender terms of species who were strong enough to fight, but wise enough not to. I have cataloged the last words of commanders who knew they were not going to win and chose to record their defeat so that others might learn from it. In all that time, I thought I had seen everything that fear could do to a person. The Kreth soldier's hands were shaking, not the fine tremor of age, a deep, rhythmic shaking that went all the way up his arms and into his shoulders. He was one of the most physically imposing beings I had ever seen in person. The Kreth were a warrior species by every biological measure, 4 limbs built for strength, armored hide that could stop a standard-grade plasma round, a nervous system that produced natural combat stimulants under stress. They had, at various points in galactic history, subjugated 11 other species and held contested space along 6 major trade corridors. They were not a species that shook. I flagged the access lockout to my supervisor, a thin-necked Velhari named As, who looked at the screen, looked at me, and then quietly walked to the far end of the archive floor without saying a word. I had worked with As for 11 cycles. I had never seen him leave a problem without at least offering an excuse. I went back to the Kreth soldier's file. His name was listed as Gureth 9, Senior Tactical Officer, 3rd Fleet, retired. The reason for displacement field still refused to open, but the system had allowed one attached document through, a scanned physical note written in old Kreth script, clearly added to the file by hand before submission. The translation software took 17 seconds longer than usual. When it finished, the text read, "I am here because the alternative is being where I was. If you want to know what I survived, open the sealed archive under Concord Order 7 and look at the oldest record inside it. Then you will understand why I will never go back to Kreth space." I had been an archivist for 19 cycles. I knew Concord Order 7 existed. Every senior archivist did. It was one of 4 standing classifications that sealed entire categories of conflict record under multilateral agreement. You were not supposed to be able to open those files without a joint authorization from 3 Concord member species, a sitting council member, and a time-locked security key that rotated every 40 days. My access clearance was high, but it was not that high. I tried anyway. I entered my credentials, added my archive seal, and pressed access. The screen went dark for 3 full seconds, then it opened. I later learned that the file had been left deliberately accessible to senior archivists for exactly this kind of situation. Someone, somewhere in the Concord bureaucracy, had decided that there needed to be at least one person in each archive who could see the record, so that if something happened again, there would be one person present who understood what they were looking at. I do not know who made that decision. I am grateful to them and slightly disturbed by the fact that they thought the possibility of something happening again was real enough to plan for. The file was enormous. It contained 4,300 subdocuments spanning 3 centuries of records, cross-referenced across 14 species and 9 separate military conflicts. The oldest document was at the top, flagged with a red marker that simply said Origin Event. I opened it. It was a distress transmission, audio, not text. The timestamp placed it 297 cycles ago, originating from a Velhari military transport convoy, 5 ships, routine resupply run to a mid-range station in the outer corridor. The convoy commander's voice was calm at first. She was reporting contact with an unknown vessel, small, single-engine, broadcasting no identification. Standard protocol was to challenge and wait. She challenged. There was no response. Then her voice changed, not to panic, to something closer to confusion. She said the unknown vessel had matched speed exactly with the third transport, moved alongside it without any active propulsion signature, and then her sensor officer reported a hull contact on the transport's starboard side. Not a docking clamp, not a breach charge, a contact, like something had simply pressed against the hull and held there. She ordered the transport to accelerate and break contact. The transport acknowledged and increased thrust. The unknown vessel stayed with it exactly, matching every maneuver with no visible engine output. Then the transport's internal communications went silent. The convoy commander waited 40 seconds. Then she said something I had to play back 3 times to believe she had said. She said, "They are inside. I don't know how they got inside. The airlock logs show no cycle. There is no breach. They are just inside." Then her own ship's internal communications went silent. The distress signal continued to broadcast for another 11 minutes, automatically, because no one was left to shut it off. The final seconds of audio before the signal degraded were not words. They were a sound I had no category for. I gave it a category. I labeled it in the file as unclassified vocalization, non-distress, origin unknown. What it sounded like, if I am being accurate and not diplomatic, was someone, somewhere on that ship, quietly laughing. I sat back in my chair and looked at the archive floor around me. Os was still at the far end, pretending to reorganize data cores that had not needed reorganizing in 8 cycles. The Kreth soldier, Gureth 9, was still watching me. When he saw my expression, something in his face shifted. Not surprise, recognition. He reached across the table with one scarred arm and picked up my translation pad. He typed slowly, in broken Concord script, pressing each character carefully with the end of his shortened limb. When he turned the pad back toward me, it read, "Now you understand why the Kreth fleet never filed a complete after-action report. We did not know how to write what happened in language that other species would believe. Whatever you read in that file, that is the reason we are here and not there." I looked at the screen. Then I looked at him. I said, "How many of your fleet came home?" He took the pad back. He typed one number. He turned it around. I had to look at it twice. Then I opened the next document in the file. It was not supposed to be a war. That is the first thing I understood after 3 days inside the sealed archive. The species now recorded in galactic history as humans, inhabiting the 3rd planet of a single star system in the outer Orion corridor, were classified by every major intelligence survey conducted before first contact as a pre-interstellar civilization with moderate technological development and no capability for sustained off-world military operations. The Kreth hegemony's own pre-invasion assessment, filed by a survey drone 40 cycles before the conflict began, described the human homeworld as a resource acquisition target of moderate yield, estimated subjugation timeline 18 standard days, expected resistance level, negligible. I found that assessment document deep in the archive, in a subfolder labeled Preliminary Intelligence Sol System. I read it twice. Then I read the after-action report filed by the surviving Kreth fleet commander 14 months after the campaign began, and I understood something important. Whoever wrote that original assessment had never seen a human. The Kreth sent 400 warships. This was not unusual for a Kreth acquisition campaign. They believed in comprehensive force projection. The initial orbital engagement took 6 hours and went exactly as planned. Human orbital infrastructure was outdated, limited, and unequipped to challenge a Kreth battle fleet. It was disabled quickly and without significant Kreth losses. The fleet commander, a decorated officer named Veth Secundus, recorded in his personal log that the campaign was proceeding exactly as expected, and that he anticipated ground operations to conclude within 10 days. The first ground assault wave landed on 3 continents simultaneously, 40,000 Kreth soldiers in powered armor, supported by atmospheric gunships and direct orbital fire support. For the first 2 hours, it went exactly as the pre-mission projections said it would. Human ground forces pulled back. They did not fight in open terrain. They retreated into cities, into mountains, into dense forest regions where Kreth sensor sweeps were degraded by terrain interference. Veth Secundus noted in his log that this was typical prey behavior and adjusted his assault timeline from 10 days to 14 to account for the additional urban and terrain clearing operations. He assigned his most experienced units to the difficult terrain, kept his standard units in the open ground where they had full advantage, and ordered his gunships to maintain constant patrol patterns over the retreat corridors. On the third night, things stopped going as planned. I read the incident reports carefully, cross-referencing between the Kreth military logs, the personal accounts of surviving Kreth officers, and a set of intercepted communications from the human command structure that had been decoded by Kreth intelligence and included in the archive file. What they described, across all those different sources, told a consistent story. But it was a story that took me a long time to fully understand, because the things being described were not things I had a mental framework for. The Kreth assault groups in the difficult terrain regions began reporting contact events at night, not mass engagements, individual contact events. A single patrol, 12 soldiers, returning to their staging area and finding 3 of their number missing from the rear of the column with no record of separation, no distress signal, no sound. A communications relay station with a crew of 8, checked at midnight and again at dawn, perfectly intact externally, crew absent, equipment untouched, rations half-eaten as though the crew had simply stood up from their meal and walked away. An armored vehicle found stopped in a mountain pass, engines still running, crew compartment empty, exterior undamaged, with no tracks or marks around it in the fresh snow. Veth Secundus received these reports and made a decision that I think, in retrospect, he would have changed if he could. He decided the missing soldiers had deserted. He put it in the log plainly. Isolated personnel experiencing first combat deployment, high-stress environment, enemy territory. This is a known attrition factor. He ordered security protocols tightened and continued the campaign. By the 8th day, he could no longer explain the missing personnel as desertion. The numbers were too high and the pattern was wrong. Deserters scattered. Deserters left traces. What was happening to his soldiers left no traces at all. They were simply there, and then they were not there, and the space where they had been was clean and quiet and undisturbed. The first direct engagement came on day 9. One of Veth Secundus's most experienced units, 64 soldiers in full combat armor with air support on immediate standby, encountered a human force in a river valley. The Kreth unit was at full strength, well supplied, holding defensible high ground. The human force, according to the Kreth unit's initial report, numbered 8 individuals. The Kreth commander on the ground radioed Veth Secundus and said, with what I imagine was complete confidence, that the engagement would be resolved in under a minute, and that he would report completion shortly. He did not report completion. The radio traffic that followed was difficult to read, not because it was corrupted or damaged, because it described things in a tone of voice, even in translation, that I recognized as the voice of someone who is watching something happen and cannot reconcile it with anything they have ever learned about how the world works. The 8 humans did not attack the Kreth position directly. They moved through the terrain around it, in the dark, in ways that the Kreth sensors should have detected and did not. They did not appear to communicate with each other in any way the Kreth equipment could pick up. No radio, no signal, nothing. They seemed to understand exactly where every Kreth soldier was, and exactly where each of them would be 30 seconds later. The engagement lasted 9 minutes. At the end of it, the Kreth unit of 64 was no longer a functioning combat force. The 8 humans withdrew into the terrain and disappeared. Veth Secundus called for his air support. He ordered a full sweep of the valley. The gunships found nothing. I sat with that report for a long time. I pulled up the human intercepted communications from that same day, the messages decoded by Kreth intelligence, and I searched for any reference to the River Valley action. I found one. It was a short message, sent from a human field element to what appeared to be a command node. The message contained the grid coordinates of the River Valley, the time, and then 6 words. Task completed, moving to next objective. 6 words. No description of the engagement. No list of what had been done. No request for acknowledgement. Just a quiet note that something was finished and they were moving on, the way a person might mark a completed item off a list. The Kreth Intercept analyst had added a note below the decoded message. It read, "We believe this communication refers to the River Valley incident. We have been unable to establish the size or composition of the human element referenced. Our best current estimate, based on the outcome and the absence of any corroborating signal traffic, is between 6 and 12 individuals. We want to note that this estimate may be incorrect. We want to note further that we do not know what to do with this information." I pulled up the Kreth pre-invasion assessment again, the one that had called humans negligible. Then I pulled up the fleet attrition report from month 4 of the campaign, 14 months after the original projected 18-day timeline. The Kreth had lost, by that point, 60% of their ground forces. They had not lost them in large engagements, in set-piece battles, in the kind of direct warfare that Kreth military doctrine was built to handle. They had lost them in the dark, in small numbers, quietly, in ways that left no evidence and generated no useful intelligence about who had done it or how. Veth Secundus filed a request to Kreth High Command for reinforcements and for information on how other species had defeated or contained what he was calling the human irregular element. High Command's response, which I found in the archive, was 6 sentences long. The first 3 sentences approved a reinforcement deployment. The last 3 were the part that stayed with me. They read, "We have queried our allied intelligence networks regarding human irregular warfare capability. We have received no useful response. We have received, however, consistent confirmation from 3 separate sources that the correct response to human irregular contact is immediate disengagement and withdrawal to defensible orbit." Veth Secundus had, by that point, been trying to disengage for 11 months. The archive document that came next was not a military report. It was a translation note, added to the file by a Kreth intelligence officer, whose name was given only as designation 4. The note explained that the Kreth translation teams had struggled for months to correctly render certain human military terminology into Kreth language, not because the words were technically complex, but because the concepts behind them had no Kreth equivalent. The note focused specifically on 2 phrases. The first phrase was special operations. In Kreth, there was no word for a military unit that was defined by what it could do rather than by how many of them there were. Kreth military thinking was built on mass and momentum. The idea that a small number of individuals could be trained, equipped, and selected to achieve outcomes that larger forces could not was not part of Kreth military culture. Designation 4 wrote, "Our closest functional translation is something like elite warrior caste, but this is not accurate. The humans do not have a warrior caste. They have a selection and training process that, in theory, any member of their military can attempt. Those who complete it are considered to have demonstrated the qualities required for this unit type. The qualities required are extensive and the process is very difficult, but the key word is any. Any human soldier can try." The second phrase was the one that stopped me. The phrase was special forces, not the unit type itself, but the broader cultural concept. Designation 4 wrote, "We initially translated this as the name of the specific unit type. We were incorrect. Through extended analysis of human communication intercepts and cultural records, we now believe the phrase has a broader meaning in human military culture. It does not refer only to the specific selected units. It refers to a standard that the entire human military aspires to. Our assessment, which we offer with the acknowledgement that it may seem implausible, is that every human soldier is trained to think of themselves as the type of soldier who does what others cannot. The specific selected units are simply the ones who have proven it formally. The others simply have not yet had the opportunity. I read that note 3 times. Then I read the Kreth after-action summary, filed at the end of the campaign, when the surviving Kreth fleet finally achieved the withdrawal to orbit that Veth Secundus had been trying to execute for 14 months. The summary was blunt. It said, "We underestimated this species at every level and at every stage. We assumed that a species without interstellar capability could not constitute a serious military threat to a hegemony-class force. We were wrong. We assumed that irregular warfare, regardless of its effectiveness, could be defeated by sufficient application of conventional force. We were wrong. We assumed that the human irregular element represented a small, specialized subset of their overall military capability. We were wrong. We do not know how many humans engaged us during this campaign. We do not know where they operated from. We do not know how they achieved the outcomes they achieved. We know only that we sent 400 ships and 11 came home. And we are filing this report so that whoever reads it does not make the same assumptions we made." I closed the document. I sat in the archive for a long time without moving. Then the access door on the far side of the room opened, and someone walked in who was not supposed to be there. The station's access log showed no entry. I checked it twice, once in real time and once after, pulling the timestamp record manually. Nothing. The door at the far end of the archive floor had a sensor array that logged every open cycle, every approach, every air pressure differential caused by a body moving through the corridor. The log was clean. The door had not opened. But someone had come through it. She was not large. That was the first thing I noticed, and I noticed it because my mind was still full of the Kreth reports, still calibrated to the scale of the things I had been reading about. And some part of me had expected that whoever was connected to those files would be larger somehow. She was a human female, shorter than average for her species based on the comparative records I had just spent 3 days reading, with dark hair pulled back flat against her head, and clothing that was not a uniform in any formal sense, but carried itself like one. She walked across the archive floor without hurrying, without looking around, without any of the behavioral signals that indicate someone entering an unfamiliar space. She walked like she had been here before. She walked like she had counted the distance from the door to my desk before she came through it. She sat down across from me without being invited. She looked at my screen, then she looked at me. "You have been reading the Order 7 file for 71 hours, she said, not as a question. Her Velhari was clean, unaccented, grammatically correct in a way that suggested she had learned it from a very good source. "You have accessed all 4 primary sections and approximately 60% of the attached documentation. You have not accessed the personnel records." I said, "Who are you?" "Commander Nora Calloway," she said, "Terran Diplomatic Corps, assigned to Concord Liaison Operations." She did not offer any documentation. She did not produce identification. She simply stated it the way a person states something they know does not require verification. I looked at the access door, then at the access log on my secondary screen. Still clean, no entry. She watched me check it. She did not comment on what I found. I said, "The Corps does not have jurisdiction over sealed archive materials." "No," she said, "it does not." She folded her hands on the table. Her hands were very still, not the stillness of relaxation, the specific stillness of someone who has trained themselves to keep their hands quiet. "But I have been tracking this archive access event for 9 hours, since the moment the Order 7 seal was opened by your credentials. And I came here because I think you have questions, and I think it is better for everyone if those questions get answers from a person, rather than from 3 centuries of military documentation written by people who were frightened. I looked at the screen. I looked at the number that Gureth 9 had typed into my translation pad 2 days earlier, the number of Kreth ships that had come home from the Saul campaign. I had not been able to get that number out of my head for 2 days. I said 11. She said yes. I said out of 400. She said yes. I said those 11, what happened to them? She said they went home, we let them go. The room was very quiet. The archive floor hummed with the low frequency of its data storage systems, a sound I had long since stopped hearing, and now I heard it again clearly because everything else was silent. I said, you let them go. She said, we needed someone to take the report home. If no one went back, no one would know what the report said. If no one knew what the report said, someone else would come. We did not want someone else to come. I had spent 3 days reading accounts of what humans had done to a 400-ship invasion fleet, and somehow this was the part that unsettled me most. Not the capability, the thinking, the careful, clear, forward-looking thinking about what outcome was actually desired and what was the precise minimum action required to achieve it. She said, ask me what you actually want to know. I had 17 questions. I sorted through them and asked the one that had been under all the others since the first hour of reading. I said you had every advantage. After the Kreth campaign, after the other attempts, you had demonstrated capability that nothing in known space was prepared to counter. Why didn't you use it? Why didn't you come out here and take what you wanted? She looked at me for a moment, not a long moment, the kind of moment that is short but full. She said, because we read our own history first. I waited. She said, humans have a long internal history. Most of it is not peaceful. We have records of what we did to each other across thousands of years, species against species, nation against nation, the same species divided against itself over land and resources and beliefs. We have very detailed records of what happened every time a group with superior capability decided to use it to take rather than to defend. We know exactly what that looks like from the outside. We know exactly what it produces. We did not come out here to reproduce it. I said, but you trained for conflict. She said, we trained because we knew conflict would come to us. It always does. The question we asked ourselves was not whether we would ever have to fight. The question was what kind of people we would be when we fought, whether we would fight to build something or fight to take something. We decided, a very long time ago, that we would only ever be good at the first one. She paused. We trained very hard to make sure that was true. I thought about the River Valley report. 8 individuals, 9 minutes, 64 Kreth soldiers who could not explain what had happened to them. I thought about the distress signal from the Velhari convoy, 297 cycles ago, the clean silence after the communications went dark, and the sound I had filed under unclassified vocalization. I said the sound at the end of that convoy transmission, the one before the signal degraded. She did not ask what transmission, she knew. I said, what was that? She was quiet for a few seconds. Then she said, that was a 19-year-old kid who had just successfully completed his first operational insertion and was very relieved. He was not supposed to be audible on that frequency. It was a mistake. He was reprimanded. She paused. He is currently a colonel. I did not know what to do with that information. I filed it alongside everything else in my mind that did not fit into any category I had previously owned. I said, are there others like you on this station? She stood. She straightened her jacket with 2 small, precise movements. She said, Zal 7, there are always others like me. You just do not see us until you need to. She looked at the access door, then back at me. The personnel files at the bottom of the Order 7 archive. Read them last. They are more useful once you understand everything else. She walked back to the door. The sensor array did not register her approach. The door opened and she stepped through it and it closed behind her. I checked the docking log. No departure recorded. I sat at my desk for a long time. Then I pulled up the personnel files. 6 months after Commander, Nora Calloway walked out of my archive without leaving a trace in any sensor log. I received a priority alert from the station's outer perimeter array. The Volkai Collective had entered the system. I knew who the Volkai were. Every senior archivist did. They were one of the 4 species in the current era that even the Conquered handled carefully, which was diplomatic language for a species that the Conquered would not directly confront. The Volkai communicated through a directed frequency technology that, at full power, could induce neurological shutdown in most carbon-based species within a 3-kilometer radius. They had used it, historically and recently, as a first strike tool, a negotiating tool, and on at least 2 documented occasions, a tool for the complete elimination of a civilization they had decided was inconvenient. They had sent 1 ship. The ship was a Volkai dreadnought class, which the archive records described as approximately 4.2 kilometers in length, crewed by roughly 12,000 individuals, and carrying offensive capability sufficient to reduce a mid-sized station to debris in under 20 minutes. It moved into the outer system at a measured, deliberate pace, the pace of something that knows it does not need to hurry. I filed an emergency request to the Conquered High Council. I filed a separate request to the Velhari Home Fleet. I filed a 3rd request through a channel I had been given by Conquered Diplomatic Operations, a quiet channel with no public routing record that went somewhere I had never needed to use before. The Conquered Council acknowledged my request and informed me that diplomatic engagement was being initiated and that I should expect a response within 72 hours. The Velhari Fleet Command acknowledged my request and informed me that the nearest fleet element was 3 days from my position. The 3rd channel was silent for 4 hours. Then it returned a single message, no header, no sender identification, 11 words in Terran Standard. We are aware. Keep the station running. Keep the lights on. I did not know what keep the lights on meant in operational terms. I kept the lights on. I reduced non-essential staff to skeleton rotation, sealed the outer archive vaults, and pulled every record in the Order 7 file to local storage in case the primary network connection was severed. I sent a personal message to Oz telling him to take the remaining archive staff to the deep interior section. He read it and replied, "Are you coming?" I replied, "Shortly." I did not go shortly. I stayed at my desk, watching the Volkai dreadnoughts approach Vector on the perimeter display, because someone had to watch it, and because I was the archivist and I did not want to leave. The dreadnought crossed the outer sensor threshold at 22 station hours after first detection. It was moving at a pace that would bring it to optimal engagement range in roughly 14 hours. Its communication array was broadcasting a standard Volkai acquisition signal, the frequency band transmission that served as both identification and warning. The station's translation system rendered it as, "This installation and all records within it are claimed under Volkai Collective Resource Authority. Non-Volkai personnel are advised to clear the installation. Resistance will not be recorded." Resistance will not be recorded. I found that particular phrasing interesting, in the way that you find something interesting when it tells you more about the speaker than they intended. They were not warning me that resistance would fail. They were telling me that they planned to ensure no record of it survived. That was a specific kind of confidence. It was also a specific kind of mistake, because it told me exactly what they feared. They feared records. They feared the archive. I went back to my desk and continued working. At the 12-hour mark, the dreadnought was close enough that the station's passive array could resolve its hull detail. It was an impressive ship. 4 kilometers of layered armor and weapons systems, and the accumulated power of a civilization that had been conquering things since before the conquered existed. It showed no sign of hesitation or caution. It had no reason to show either. At the 10-hour mark it slowed. not decelerated in the standard approach and brake pattern. Slowed, reduced thrust and held position for approximately 11 minutes, then resumed approach at a noticeably lower velocity. I watched this happen and did not understand it. There was nothing in the approach corridor that should have caused a navigation adjustment. No debris field, no gravitational anomaly, no other vessel, nothing on any sensor. At the 8-hour mark, it slowed again. This time it held position for longer, nearly 30 minutes before resuming. Its communication array had gone quiet. The acquisition signal had stopped broadcasting. I filed a note in the station log. Volkai Dreadnought communication silence, unexplained, duration ongoing. At the 6-hour mark, the Dreadnought stopped moving entirely. I watched the perimeter display for a long time. The icon that represented the Dreadnought sat motionless at the edge of mid-range sensor resolution. 4 kilometers of military hardware sitting perfectly still in open space with no apparent reason for stopping. The station's AI logged the event as navigation hold, origin unknown. Then the Dreadnought's internal communication array began transmitting. Not externally, not toward the station. Internally. The station's passive sensors could detect that a very large volume of internal traffic was occurring within the Volkai ship, but could not decode it. What they could measure was the pattern. Short, rapid bursts of transmission back and forth between different sections of the ship, the frequency and urgency of which the system characterized as high-stress command communication. Something was happening on that ship, something that the Volkai command structure had not anticipated and was working very hard to respond to. I pulled up the station's passive thermal array, a system designed for tracking power output from nearby vessels for navigational safety purposes. It was not a combat sensor and had a limited resolution range. At 6 hours distance, it could not give me detailed information about what was happening on the Volkai hull. It could give me aggregate heat signatures. For 5 hours and 40 minutes, the thermal array showed a single coherent heat signature from the Dreadnought, the normal operating output of a ship-sized vessel at reduced thrust. Engines, life support, weapons systems on standby. A clean, consistent, expected profile. At the 5-hour and 41-minute mark, the array recorded a secondary signature. Small, localized, moving. The resolution was not good enough to give me a precise reading. What the array could tell me was the approximate scale of the signature, its location relative to the Dreadnought's hull, and its movement pattern. The scale was consistent with a single human-sized individual. The location was the outer hull, near the Dreadnought's primary command section. The movement pattern was not random. It was purposeful. It moved quickly to a point, held position for several minutes, moved to another point, held position, moved again. It continued this pattern for 1 hour and 17 minutes. Then it stopped appearing on the array entirely. Not because it had returned inside. I checked the return readings carefully. There was no re-entry signature. The heat profile simply ended cleanly between one scan cycle and the next. Whatever it had been, it had not gone back the way it came. 2 hours after the thermal signature disappeared, the Volkai Dreadnought began to move. Not toward the station, away from it. A slow, damaged-looking acceleration, one engine group firing irregularly, the kind of thrust pattern that ships produce when their systems are partially compromised. Its communication array came back online briefly, but instead of the acquisition signal, it was broadcasting on internal emergency frequencies. It was leaving. It took 3 more hours to clear the outer sensor range, moving at roughly 40% of its approach velocity. One engine group dark, its hull running 15 degrees warmer than standard operating temperature, which is what ships do when their coolant systems have been disturbed. I watched it go on the perimeter display until the icon disappeared past the sensor boundary, and then I sat in the quiet archive and listened to the hum of the data storage systems, and I did not know exactly what I had just watched happen. I knew, approximately, what I had watched happen. I had watched one person, moving alone on the outer hull of an enemy ship in hard vacuum, accomplish something that had caused a 12,000-strong crew to abandon an acquisition mission and limp home with system damage they had not arrived with. I had watched the outcome. I had not watched the method, because the method had taken place in the dark, on the outside of a 4-kilometer warship, at a scale, and in a manner that no sensor array was designed to observe. I filed a station log entry. Volocai acquisition vessel withdrew from system without engaging target. No weapons fired by either party. Cause of withdrawal, undetermined. Then I added a personal note marked private that only I could access. Correction. The cause of withdrawal was determined. I simply do not have precise language for it yet. I am working on the language. A year after the Volocai ship went home, I started writing the record. This is the job. This is what I have always done. Things happen in the galaxy, conflicts and contacts and moments that will become history, and someone has to write them down accurately so that the species who come after us understand what occurred and why and what it means. I have written down defeats and surrenders and the ends of civilizations. I have written down treaties and their inevitable violations and the consequences of both. I have written down everything that I thought was important to preserve. The human record was different. I had been carrying it for a year, not writing it, because every time I sat down to begin, I found that my usual language for military events did not fit. I had words for invasion and conquest. I had words for resistance and defeat. I did not have good words for what humans were, because they did not fit into the categories that galactic history had given me to work with. I spent 3 months reading everything in the Order 7 archive, not just the Kreth material from the Sol campaign, but every subsequent record, every incident across 3 centuries where humans had been involved in a conflict or a contact event. There were more of them than I had expected. Most of them did not appear in any public Concord record. They appeared only here, in this sealed file, accessible to almost no one. The pattern in all of them was the same. A threat would appear directed at someone somewhere. A civilization being pressured by a larger power. A station or convoy or research post put at risk by a species that had decided it could take what it wanted. A small world that had been noticed by the wrong kind of neighbor. And then, quietly, something would change. The threat would recede. The pressure would stop. The ship that had been circling would turn and go somewhere else. In most cases, there was no visible explanation for why. In the cases where evidence existed, the evidence pointed toward human involvement, and the human involvement pointed toward a very small number of individuals doing something that changed the outcome. I found a Concord internal memorandum from 40 cycles ago, written by a council member whose name was redacted, that addressed the human presence in these incidents directly. The memorandum argued that the Concord should formally acknowledge human operational capability and either bring it under Concord oversight or declare it a threat. The response memo, filed 3 weeks later, said, "We have considered this proposal carefully. Our assessment is that human capability, as currently employed, is being directed toward the protection of Concord member interests and the deterrence of species whose actions the Concord lacks the unified political will to address directly. The proposal to declare this capability a threat is not supported by the evidence, as the capability has not been directed against any Concord member species. The proposal to bring it under Concord oversight is not practical, as our models suggest humans would not accept oversight from a body they do not fully trust with operational security, and that any attempt to impose it would result in the loss of the benefit currently provided. Recommended action: continue current arrangement. Do not examine it closely." I read that memorandum several times. Continue current arrangement. Do not examine it closely. The Concord, the most powerful political body in known space, had looked at what humans were doing across the galaxy and had decided that the correct response was to quietly benefit from it and ask no questions. I thought about that for a long time. I thought about what it meant that the Concord's position was essentially that humans were doing something useful that no one else could do, and that the best policy was to let them continue and avoid the awkwardness of acknowledging it. Then Commander Calloway came back. She arrived the same way she had the first time, with no entry record and no announcement, except this time she brought two others. Both humans, both carrying the same quality of stillness and attention that I had come to recognize as specific to her kind of person. One was a man she introduced as Captain Owen Darby, compact and unhurried, with the same way of entering a room as though he had already been in it. The other was a woman introduced as Lieutenant Priya Adler, younger, quieter, who stood near the door at an angle that gave her sight lines to every corner of the room. I noticed that she clocked every exit without appearing to look for them. I noticed that I had only noticed this because I had spent a year reading about people like her. Calloway sat across from me again. She put a data chip on the table between us. She said the parts that were redacted from the original file, the sections that were removed before it was sealed under Order 7, you should have the full record. I looked at the chip. I said, "What is on it?" She said, "Our side." I picked it up. I said, "Why now?" She said, "Because you are writing the record, and the record that exists right now is only one side of the story. It is accurate, but it is incomplete. You have the accounts of every species that came into contact with human operations and came away from that contact with a changed understanding of what they were facing. You do not have the accounts of the human operatives themselves." I said, "And those accounts are different." She said, "They are different in one important way." I waited. She said, "In every account written by other species, the humans involved are described as something close to fearless, precise, capable, deliberate, without doubt. The reports written about us read as though we were machines built for a specific purpose, running smoothly and without difficulty." She folded her hands on the table. "The after-action reports we wrote ourselves are different. Every single one of them includes an honest record of what the individual was experiencing during the operation. Fear, doubt, the moments when the plan did not work and they had to decide in a fraction of a second what to do instead. The moments when they thought they were going to fail." She paused. "We were terrified, all of us, every time. The point was never to not be afraid. The point was to be afraid and to go anyway, because there was something on the other side of that fear that mattered more than the fear itself." I held the data chip. I said, "What mattered more?" She said, "You do." I said, "I am not sure I understand." She said, "The station you are sitting in. The archive you have spent 19 cycles maintaining. The records of 52 civilizations that no longer exist, preserved here so that the galaxy does not forget what happened to them and why. The Velhari researcher 3 doors down who has been working on the same linguistic problem for 8 years and has almost solved it. The Kreth veteran in your intake processing bay who came here because he needed somewhere safe to go and he trusted the archive to be that place." She looked at me steadily. "All of it. The whole accumulated, imperfect, complicated project of different species trying to understand each other and share space without destroying each other. That is what mattered more. Every time." I did not speak for a while. I thought about Owen Darby, standing quietly near the filing stacks with his hands easy at his sides, and about Priya Adler near the door, watching every line of sight in the room, and about the anonymous person who had been on the outer hull of a Voakai dreadnought in hard vacuum, doing something that had made 12,000 Voakai decide to go home. I thought about the 19-year-old who had laughed on an open frequency and been reprimanded and become a colonel. I thought about Gureth 9, who had typed a single number into my translation pad and watched me understand what it meant. I said, "I have been trying to find the right category to file humans under in the archive classification system. I have not found one that fits." She said, "What are the categories?" I said, "Threat species, allied species, neutral species, historical species, diplomatic contact pending under observation." She looked at me without expression for a moment. Then she said, "None of those." I said, "I know." She said, "What will you use?" I said, "I have been thinking about a new one." She looked at the data chip in my hand. She said, "Read the personnel records first, then finish the classification." She stood. She nodded to Darby and Adler and they moved to the door together. She said, "The record matters, Zal 7. Get it right." Then they were gone, all three of them, as quietly as they had arrived. I put the chip into my reader. I started with the personnel records as she had suggested. I read for 9 hours without stopping. I read the reports of human operatives writing in their own words, in their own voices, about what it had felt like and what they had been thinking, and what had kept them going when the practical calculation said that stopping was the rational choice. None of them had stopped. Not one across 3 centuries of records, in situations that every reasonable framework for risk assessment would have classified as untenable. They had been afraid, and they had noted that they were afraid, and they had continued anyway, and the reason they had continued, stated in different words by hundreds of different people across 300 years, was always the same reason. It was not glory. It was not conquest. It was not the thrill of the action or the desire to prove something. It was the simple, clear, stubborn conviction that someone had to, and they were the ones who were there. I spent 4 days writing the record. When I was done, I created a new classification in the archive system. I called it Threshold Guardian. I defined it as follows: a species that, through the specific development of individual and collective capability oriented toward protection rather than acquisition, has come to occupy the functional role of limiting factor against escalation in contested galactic space, distinguished from allied species by the fact that the relationship is not formally acknowledged or politically administered, distinguished from threat species by the consistent directionality of capability deployment, which is toward defense of existing conditions rather than alteration in favor of the guardian species. I filed it. Then I wrote the entry summary for the human record, the short text that would appear at the top of the file as a guide for any archivist who accessed it in the future and needed to understand quickly what they were looking at. I wrote it 7 times before I was satisfied with it. The final version read: other species built navies. Other species built empires. Humans built something that had no name in any prior galactic taxonomy, a military tradition in which the measure of capability was not how much force could be brought to bear, but how few people, doing what seemed impossible, could change the outcome of something that mattered. They called the most formal expression of this tradition special forces. They trained every soldier to want to be that. They selected from those, the ones who could actually do it, and they gave those people the hardest work in the galaxy and almost no acknowledgement for doing it. And those people went, because that was the agreement they had made with themselves about what kind of people they were going to be. The galaxy did not fear humans because they were without mercy. The galaxy did not fear humans because they were without limit. The galaxy feared humans because they were afraid, genuinely, honestly afraid, and they came anyway, every time, and they came for reasons that had nothing to do with themselves. They fought the way people fight when they are not fighting to win something. They fought the way people fight when they are fighting so that the people they love do not have to. I filed the record. I locked the new classification under my archivist seal. I sent a copy to the Concord Historical Division with a cover note recommending it be moved to permanent open access rather than retained under sealed classification, on the grounds that a species doing what humans were doing deserved, at minimum, to have someone say it plainly. I do not know if the Council will approve that recommendation. I suspect they will not, because the Concord is very comfortable with the arrangement of quietly benefiting from human capability without examining it closely. An open access classification would require them to examine it closely and make a public decision about what they thought. But the record exists now. The full record with both sides of the story, as complete as I could make it from everything I had access to. If something happens again, and someone opens this file for the same reason I opened it, they will find the whole picture. They will find the Kreth fleet assessment that called humans negligible. They will find the after-action report that counted 11 ships going home from 400. They will find the River Valley report, 8 individuals, 9 minutes, 64 Kreth soldiers who could not explain what had happened to them. They will find the thermal signature on the outside of a Volkai dreadnought, moving with purpose in hard vacuum, doing something that turned 4 kilometers of warship around. They will find the voice of a 19-year-old on an open frequency, relieved that he had done something very difficult and was still alive to note it. And they will find what he wrote when he was older, in his own after-action reports, because Nora Calloway had included those in the chip she brought me, along with the files of everyone else, the long, honest records of what it had actually felt like from the inside. His name was Captain Eli Marsh. He had been writing after-action reports for 30 years when the most recent one was filed. The last line of the last report in his file, written after an operation the details of which were classified above even my clearance level, read, "Objective achieved. All elements returned. I was scared the whole time. I am proud of everyone. We go again when they need us. We go again when they need us." I closed the file. I looked around the archive floor, the data cores, the filing systems, the processing terminals, the quiet hum of 3 centuries of galactic history preserved and indexed, and made available to anyone who needed to understand the past in order to navigate the present. I thought about the 52 species whose final records lived in here. I thought about the civilizations that had ended because no one was in the right place at the right time, doing the right thing for the right reason. I thought about the archive's outer door, which I would check again tomorrow morning, knowing that the sensor log would show no entry and no departure, and knowing what that meant. They were there, they were always there, and they would go again when they were needed. The galaxy prayed it would never need them. The galaxy was going to need them. It always did.